Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about fear. We're diving deep into why we feel it, where it comes from, and how we can maybe even just maybe learn to dance with it, you know? It's kind of wild how fear sticks around, even when, our lives are pretty safe overall, wouldn't you say?
Oh, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It really is.
It seems like, we've evolved past, running from saber-toothed tigers, but our brains haven't quite caught up.
Like we're still on high alert for threats that just aren't around anymore.
Exactly. That's what the source Overcoming Fear calls ancient wiring. Think about it this way. Have you ever had, your heart racing over something that logically wasn't a big deal?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Like a mini freak out over a work email.
Totally. That's your ancient wiring kicking in. It's programmed to react to everyday stressors like, bills, deadlines, social situations, as if they were life or death threats.
So basically, our bodies are ready to battle a woolly mammoth when we're just, facing a traffic jam.
Precisely. Our bodies are still in that fight or flight mode, ready to confront or escape danger, even when the danger isn't real.
It makes you wonder, is there a right way to even deal with fear? The source mentions these two childhood friends. One was totally fearless, the other super anxious. They both, seemed to figure out life, even with those, very different relationships with fear.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and it really highlights that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. This is where the idea of balance comes in. We need to find that middle ground between recklessness and paralyzing fear, right?
Right.
We need to find a way to dance with fear, not just constantly fight it.
Learning some new dance steps would be great. But first, I think we need to unpack how fear actually works, in our minds and bodies.
Absolutely. The source, How to Manage Anxiety and Fear, describes it really well. Picture this. You perceive a threat, real or imagined. Your body immediately goes through a bunch of changes, like your heart races, you breathe faster, your muscles tense up. It's like your body is saying, okay, time to either fight this thing or run away.
Okay, but how do we, manage those feelings, those physical symptoms?
Well, this source offers a really helpful technique called the 4-7-8 breathing exercise.
Okay.
And it helps calm your body's response to fear. Basically, you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 7, and exhale for 8. It's a way to interrupt that fight or flight response and tell your body, hey, we're actually okay here.
I'm adding that to my mental toolkit for sure. But beyond just, managing symptoms, how do we start changing our overall mindset about fear?
Well, that's where some of the great thinkers come in.
Yeah.
Our sources, Overcoming Fear and Stoicism, How to Worry Less in Hard Times, both point to Stoicism as a really helpful framework.
Stoicism. Now, that's a philosophy I've always wanted to understand better. How do Stoics approach fear?
Well, the Stoics believe that fear was mainly rooted in our judgment about events.
Okay.
Not the events themselves, So it's not the actual situation that's scary, but the meaning we give it. By changing our perception, we can change our emotional response.
Okay, so, let's say I'm terrified of public speaking.
Yeah.
How would a Stoic approach that?
Okay, so instead of viewing it as, potential humiliation, a Stoic might see it as a chance to share valuable information or connect with the audience or simply practice a skill, right?
So changing your perspective can change the entire experience.
Exactly. Stoicism also focuses on what we can and cannot control. The Stoics have this idea that there are things we can control and things we can't.
Right.
And focusing on what we can control is key. We control our actions, our thoughts, our responses, but we can't control external events like the economy or other people's opinions.
So, for example, if I'm, worried about an economic downturn, a Stoic would say to focus on my finances and skills rather than freaking out about the things I can't control.
Precisely. There's also this really interesting Stoic concept called premeditatio malorum.
Premeditatio malorum.
Yeah, which means negative visualization.
Negative visualization. That sounds a little intense.
I know, right? It might seem counterintuitive, but the Stoics believed that imagining the worst-case scenario actually helped reduce its power.
Oh, you're mentally preparing for the worst, so it doesn't hit you as hard if it actually happens?
That's the idea. It takes away the element of surprise and gives you a chance to, plan and prepare. Let's say you're afraid of losing your job.
Okay.
Instead of pushing that fear away, you could spend some time thinking about what you would do if it actually happened. You could update your resume, network with people, even start exploring other career options.
So it's like saying to your fear, okay, I see you, you're there, but I'm not going to let you paralyze me.
Exactly. You're acknowledging the fear, but also taking away its power by being prepared. Now, while Stoicism offers some practical approaches to fear, there are other philosophers who looked at it in a completely different way. One of our sources, The Ending of Fear, Krishnamurti, introduces us to the philosopher Krishnamurti and his unique perspective.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting for me. I've heard the name Krishnamurti, but I don't really know much about his ideas. How did he view fear?
Well, unlike the Stoics who focused on, techniques for managing fear, Krishnamurti was more interested in understanding its root causes. He asked a very thought-provoking question. Why haven't we, with all our intelligence, solved the problem of fear as we've solved other problems? He believed that fear stems from a place of self-centeredness, which leads to a feeling of deep loneliness.
I'm curious about that connection. How does, like, being self-centered lead to fear?
Well, he believed that when we're constantly focused on ourselves, our own needs and desires, we create this separation between us and the world. Do you think there's a connection between feeling isolated and feeling fearful?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like building walls around yourself for protection, but then those walls end up trapping you in a prison of fear.
That's a great way to put it. And Krishnamurti's suggestion is to face that loneliness head on, not try to run away from it or explain it away. He believed that directly confronting that feeling could actually lead to a radical change in our relationship with fear.
It sounds like a very different approach from Stoicism. It's like Stoicism gives us the tools to manage fear, while Krishnamurti wants us to really explore like where our fears come from on a deeper level.
That's a great way to summarize it. They both offer valuable insights into the nature of fear and how to navigate it.
So we've talked about the history of fear, why it's still hanging around, what some big thinkers have to say about it. But what about us everyday folks trying to deal with our own fears? What can we actually do to overcome them?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And thankfully, our sources offer some concrete tips. Overcoming fear has a bunch of strategies we can use right away.
Okay, let's hear them. I'm ready for some actionable advice.
Okay, first, identify and analyze your fear. Spend some time really understanding what you're afraid of and why. Try to separate the facts from the assumptions you're making. Sometimes just bringing your fears into the light of day can help shrink them down.
It's like shining a light on the monster under the bed. It suddenly seems a lot less scary.
Exactly. Another tip is to challenge your negative thoughts. What's the worst that could happen?
Right.
And how likely is it to actually happen? Often, our fears are way bigger in our minds than they are in reality.
Which reminds me of that Stoic practice of negative visualization. By imagining the worst, we can often see that it's not as bad as we imagined.
You got it. And speaking of Stoicism, they were big on taking action, which is a key part of overcoming fear. Start with small steps towards facing your fear. Each successful step builds your confidence and proves that you're braver than you think.
Like that old saying, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Absolutely. Don't try to conquer your fear all at once. Break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces. And don't underestimate the power of visualization. Imagine yourself successfully navigating the situation you fear. This mental rehearsal can actually lower your anxiety and give you a boost of confidence.
Visualization is a powerful tool. Athletes use it, performers use it, even like business leaders.
Yeah,
It makes perfect sense that it could help with like conquering fear too.
totally. And here's another important point. Don't be afraid to learn from your fears. Even the scary experiences can teach you something valuable and help you grow.
So it's about seeing fear not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a teacher, maybe even a guide on our journey.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. And finally, remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking action even when you're scared. It's that classic idea of feeling the fear and doing it anyway.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of fear,
Dude.
and I'm already feeling a bit more courageous.
That's wonderful to hear. It's amazing how, a shift in perspective can completely change how we experience and respond to fear. Fear is a natural part of being human.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to control us.
This deep dive has definitely reminded me that we have more power over fear than we realize. But before we wrap up part one, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Can you think back to a time when you successfully faced a fear? What did you learn from that experience?
Yeah.
How did it change you? And maybe even think about those two childhood friends from earlier, the fearless one and the anxious one. Maybe as adults, they both found their own ways to dance with fear, each learning valuable lessons along the way.
That's a great reflection to leave our listeners with. It reminds us that there's no one right way to deal with fear, and that we can all find our own path to courage and resilience.
So how about you? What will your next step be in this dance with fear? We'd love to hear your thoughts when we come back for part 2.
It's interesting, this whole conversation about fear, how it's taken us from like breathing exercises to stoic philosophers to like questioning the very root of our fears.
It really does.
It really shows you just how complex this emotion is.
Totally. We've gone from the physical sensations of fear all the way to the core of who we are.
Yeah.
It's wild how fear can shape the way we see the world, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And throughout our discussion, one theme that keeps popping up is the power of perspective.
Mhm.
Think about it. Whether we're like reframing our thoughts like the Stoics or exploring the roots of fear with Krishnamurti or just trying to feel more connected to the world around us, it all comes down to shifting our perspective.
Yeah, it's like putting on a new pair of glasses. Suddenly everything looks different, even the things that used to seem, so scary.
That's a great analogy. And this idea of changing our perspective isn't just some you know, abstract philosophical concept. It's something we can actually practice in our daily lives.
Right.
One of our sources, Overcoming Fear, gives some really practical tips for doing just that.
Mm.
Things like, challenging negative thoughts, visualizing success, and even learning from our fears.
I love that it's like taking those big philosophical ideas and turning them into actions, we can actually take.
Exactly. And these practices can be super helpful in navigating what the source calls modern fear, that feeling of being overwhelmed and uncertain in today's world.
Oh, yeah.
By, learning to see things from a broader perspective, we build up the resilience and flexibility we need to thrive in a world that's constantly changing.
Yeah, it's like learning to ride the waves instead of getting knocked over by them.
Perfect analogy. It's about finding that balance between holding on and letting go, right?
Right.
We need to hold on to our values, our goals, our sense of purpose, but we also need to let go of trying to control everything, predict the future, or avoid any discomfort.
And this brings us back to another key takeaway from our deep dive so far. The importance of taking action.
Yeah.
Whether it's taking small steps to face a fear, focusing on what we can control, or just living in line with our values, action seems to be a big part of overcoming fear.
Couldn't agree more. Remember, real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in spite of it.
Yeah.
Every time we act, even though we're scared, we're basically, doing a workout for our courage muscle.
Yeah.
And that makes us capable of even more growth.
I like that, the courage muscle.
Yeah.
Got to get it strong. Okay, so we've talked about stoicism
Yeah.
and its emphasis on action and changing our perspective. But I want to go back to Krishnamurti for a minute.
All right.
His ideas were so different and thought-provoking. Can you remind us what his take on fear was and how it can help us?
Sure. Krishnamurti's perspective is really unique. He believed that fear comes from a deep-seated self-centeredness, basically being overly preoccupied with our own needs, wants, and worries. And he suggests that this self-absorption creates this sense of separation from the world around us, which then leads to loneliness, insecurity, and ultimately fear.
It's like we build walls around ourselves thinking we're protecting ourselves, but then those walls end up becoming our prison.
That's such a powerful image. And Krishnamurti's solution wasn't to find some external fix for fear. It was to directly address that root cause. Our own self-centeredness. He encouraged a radical shift in perspective, turning away from the ego and towards a sense of self that's connected to something bigger than just our individual needs,
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds almost like a spiritual journey,
Mhm.
moving from a limited sense of self to a more expansive one.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that fear often comes from an illusion of separateness, the belief that we're isolated individuals battling against the world.
Right.
By nurturing a sense of interconnectedness, of belonging to something larger than ourselves, we can start to dissolve the fear that grows from that illusion.
So it's not just about conquering our fears. It's about changing our entire worldview in a way that shrinks the space that fear occupies in our lives.
That's a brilliant way to put it. And this idea of interconnectedness resonates with a lot of spiritual traditions, that emphasize compassion, empathy, and a sense of unity with all beings. By cultivating these qualities, we start to see ourselves not as isolated individuals, but as threads in a vast interconnected web of life.
This adds a whole other dimension to like how we understand fear,
Mm.
right? It's not just about like managing emotions or changing our thought.
Right.
It's about shifting like our whole way of seeing the world and our place in it. But like, how do we actually do that? How do we cultivate this sense of interconnectedness?
That's a fantastic question. It's something that deserves its own deep dive. But for now, we can begin by simply noticing, how we're already connected to the world around us.
Right.
Pay attention to the air you breathe, the sunlight on your skin, the food that nourishes you. Realize that you're not separate from these things, but a part of this intricate web of life.
So it's about cultivating gratitude
Yeah.
for everything that sustains us and recognizing that we're not isolated beings, but like participants in this grand symphony of existence.
Exactly. And as we become more aware of our interconnectedness, we can start to, expand our compassion and empathy beyond ourselves to include all beings. This shift in perspective can have a profound impact on how we experience fear,
Hmm.
right? It helps us move from like a sense of isolation and lack to a feeling of belonging and abundance.
This has been such an insightful exploration of fear, its origins, its many forms, and the like potential ways to overcome it. We've talked about the Stoics' practical strategies, the profound insights of Krishnamurti, and the like transformative power of cultivating a sense of interconnectedness. But before we move on to part 3, I'd love to leave our listeners with a final thought, like a question to ponder as they continue exploring their own relationship with fear.
I think that's a wonderful idea. What question do you have in mind?
If fear often stems from a sense of separation, from a limited view of who we are, what would it feel like to live from a place of like wholeness, of unity, of boundless love and compassion? What might become possible if we could truly embody this like expanded sense of self?
That is a powerful and thought-provoking question. It invites us to step beyond the limitations of our fears and enter a realm of like infinite possibility. It challenges us to envision a world where fear doesn't hold us captive, but where we're free to live, love, and create from a place of deep connection and boundless courage.
It's a beautiful vision, and I believe it's a vision within our reach. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of fear. We'll be back with part 3 soon. Welcome back to our deep dive into fear. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more empowered after exploring all these different perspectives.
Me too. It's really amazing how understanding something can just kind of take away its power, right?
Yeah, we've covered so much ground already. The history of fear, the Stoics, Krishnamurti, the power of changing our perspective.
Yeah. And throughout our conversation, I think a key takeaway has been the importance of action. Like, we can't just think our way out of fear. We have to, like, actually do something about it.
Absolutely. Whether it's like facing a fear in small steps,
Right.
focusing on what we can control, or just living in alignment with our values, action seems to be like the key ingredient in overcoming fear.
One of our sources, Overcoming Fear, had a really interesting point about fear in the modern world. It talked about how our ancient wiring, which evolved to protect us from, physical threats, is now being triggered by all these modern day stressors.
Right. Like our brains haven't quite figured out that a work deadline isn't the same as a saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
it's even more important now to have those tools and perspectives that help us, manage fear effectively. We need to be able to tell the difference between real threats and those that are just like figments of our imagination.
It's like separating the monsters under the bed from the actual monsters out there in the world.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where those stoic practices we talked about can be so helpful. Remembering that we can't control everything, but we can control our own actions, thoughts, and responses. And then there's that practice of negative visualization, which can help us prepare for the worst case scenario and, take away some of its power.
It's like taking the sting out of fear by looking it straight in the eye.
Precisely. We're basically, desensitizing ourselves to fear, building up our resilience and saying, hey, fear, I see you, but you don't control me.
And what about Krishnamurti's idea that fear stems from self-centeredness? How does that fit into this idea of like taking action?
Krishnamurti's perspective really challenges us to look inward. He suggests that our preoccupation with our own, needs and desires can lead to a sense of separation and isolation, which then, breeds fear. But if we can shift our focus outward towards something, bigger than ourselves, that fear starts to dissolve.
So it's not just about conquering fear, it's about cultivating a worldview that makes less room for fear to begin with.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our true nature is connected to something much larger than, our individual egos. And by nurturing that connection, by cultivating compassion and empathy for all beings, we can start to heal the fear that arises from, feeling separate and alone.
This has been such an incredible journey of exploring fear. We've gone from the physical sensations of fear to the very core of our being, looking at how fear shapes our thoughts, our perceptions, and our experience of the world.
Yeah, and through it all, we've really seen the power of perspective, whether we're, reframing our thoughts like the Stoics, confronting the root causes of fear with Krishnamurti, or cultivating a sense of interconnectedness. It all comes down to shifting our perspective, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like changing the lens through which we see the world. And suddenly, things that once seemed terrifying, they start to appear smaller, less overwhelming, or even lose their power completely.
And this power of perspective isn't just a philosophical concept. It's something we can actively cultivate in our daily lives. Remember those practical tips from overcoming fear. Challenging negative thoughts, visualizing success, learning from our fears. These are tools that anyone can use, regardless of their, philosophical beliefs.
It's about taking those abstract ideas and turning them into concrete actions that can actually make a difference in how we experience fear.
Exactly. And those practices can be especially helpful in navigating the, complexities and uncertainties of modern life. By cultivating a broader, more expansive perspective, we build up the resilience and adaptability we need to thrive in a world that's constantly changing.
It's like learning to surf on the waves of change rather than, getting tossed around by them.
I love that analogy. It really captures the idea of finding that delicate balance between holding on and letting go. We need to hold on to our values, our goals, and our sense of purpose while letting go of the need to control everything, to predict the future, or to, avoid discomfort.
And that brings us full circle to the importance of taking action, whether it's facing a fear in small steps, taking responsibility for what we can control, or acting in alignment with our values. It's through action that we truly move beyond fear.
It's been so fascinating how this deep dive into fear has taken us from the, practicalities of breathing exercises and stoic techniques to the profound depths of self-awareness and interconnectedness. It really highlights the, multifaceted nature of fear and the many paths we can take to understand and overcome it.
It's like we've journeyed from the physical sensations of fear all the way to the very essence of who we are, exploring how fear influences our perceptions, our thoughts, and ultimately our experience of life.
And as we conclude our deep dive, I think it's important to remember that we're not alone on this journey. We have the wisdom of the Stoics, the insights of Krishnamurti, and a whole toolbox of practical strategies at our disposal. But most importantly, we have the power to choose how we respond to fear, to cultivate a wider perspective, and to create a life that reflects our, deepest values.
So well said. As we navigate the inevitable ups and downs of life, let's remember that fear, while a powerful emotion, doesn't get to have the final word. We have the power to choose courage, connection, and a life lived not in the shadows of fear, but in the brilliant light of our true selves.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. May your journey be filled with courage, compassion, and a growing sense of wonder for this magnificent interconnected web of life we're all a part of.